There is a generation that learned how to survive without ever being taught how to feel. They grew up in a world that didn't pause for them. No constant guidance, no digital safety net, no voice telling them they were special every step of the way. Just silence, responsibility, and the quiet expectation to figure things out on their own. And maybe that's why even today, they don't ask for much. But here's the part no one really talks about. That independence, it came with a cost. Because the people born between 1965 and 1980, what we call Gen X, weren't just raised differently, they were shaped by absence. Not always physical absence. Sometimes it was emotional, subtle, invisible. The kind that teaches you, very early on, that relying on others might not always work out. So instead, you rely on yourself. You become your own backup plan, your own support system, and over time, that turns into something powerful, but also something quietly heavy. Because when you've spent your entire life being the one who handles everything, you forget what it feels like to be held by someone else. And this is where it gets interesting. Gen X isn't loud about their struggles. They don't turn everything into a public conversation. In fact, they mastered the art of appearing okay, even when they're not. Not because they're hiding, but because they were never taught how to express it in the first place. Think about it. They were the generation that came home to empty houses, made their own meals, solved their own problems. They didn't have someone checking in every hour. They had space, a lot of it. And while that space created independence, it also created emotional distance. Because when you grow up learning that your feelings are yours to deal with, you don't naturally learn how to share them. You learn how to manage them, contain them, silence them, and over time, that becomes your default setting. But here's the paradox. The same people who seem the strongest on the outside are often the ones carrying the most unspoken weight on the inside. They don't break easily, but they also don't open easily. And that changes how they move through life. In relationships, they value loyalty over expression. In work, they value stability over recognition. In life, they value peace over attention. Not because they don't want more, but because they learned early on not to expect it. And this creates a kind of quiet resilience that most people don't fully understand. It's not loud, it's not performative, it's steady, almost invisible. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because while Gen X learned how to be self-sufficient, the world around them started changing in a completely different direction. Suddenly, vulnerability became a strength, expression became encouraged, sharing became normal. And for a generation that was built on quiet endurance, this shift felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, not wrong, just different. Because imagine being taught your whole life to handle things privately, and then being told that opening up is the new strength. It doesn't come naturally. It feels like learning a new language later in life. And that's why, even today, many people from this generation sit in a strange space. They understand emotion, they feel deeply, but they don't always show it in ways others recognize. And sometimes that gets misunderstood as distance. But it's not distance, it's conditioning. And once you see that, you start to understand something deeper about them. They are not disconnected. They are just wired differently. But what's even more fascinating is what this has done to their identity over time. Because while other generations were being defined loudly, Gen X stayed quiet, almost unnoticed, and that raises a question most people never ask. What happens to a generation that learns to survive so well that the world forgets to check on them? Because that might be where their real story begins. And it's not what you think. What happens is they become the ones everyone depends on, but rarely notices. They become the steady ground in a world that keeps shifting. The ones who don't panic easily, the ones who don't need constant reassurance, the ones who just handle things. But here's the hidden layer most people miss. When you spend your life being the one others rely on, you slowly stop expecting anyone to rely on you back. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly, subtly. You stop reaching out as much. You stop explaining how you feel. You convince yourself that you're fine because that's what you've always done. And over time, that becomes your identity. Strong, independent, low maintenance. But underneath that identity, there's something more human. A need that never fully disappears. The need to be understood without having to explain everything. The need to feel seen without having to ask for it. And this is where Gen X lives emotionally, in between strength and silence, because they are strong enough to carry things alone. But that doesn't mean they were meant to. And yet, they rarely say that out loud. Not because they don't feel it, but because they've trained themselves not to need it. And if you've ever met someone from this generation, you've probably felt it. That calm presence, that grounded energy, that sense that they've already figured out how to deal with life, even when life isn't easy. But what you don't always see is how much they've had to figure out alone. Because their childhood didn't revolve around constant validation. It revolved around adaptation. They adapted to change, to uncertainty, to emotional gaps that were never clearly explained. And in doing so, they became incredibly capable. But capability can sometimes mask something deeper. Exhaustion. Not the kind you talk about, the kind you carry. Quietly. Because when you're used to being the one who holds everything together, you don't always give yourself permission to fall apart, even when you need to. And this shapes how they view the world today. They don't chase attention. They chase stability. They don't overshare. They observe. They don't react quickly. They process slowly. And in a world that moves fast, speaks loudly, and shares constantly, that can make them feel out of place. Not because they don't belong, but because they were built for a different rhythm. A slower one, a more grounded one. And maybe that's why they often feel caught between generations, too independent to fully relate to younger generations who express everything. Too emotionally aware to fully relate to older generations who suppressed everything. They stand in the middle, bridging two worlds, understanding both, but not fully belonging to either. And that space can feel isolating, but it's also what makes them unique. Because Gen X didn't just adapt to the world, they learned how to observe it, to question it, to move through it without losing themselves completely. And that's a kind of strength that doesn't always get recognized, but it's there. In the way they stay calm when things get chaotic. In the way they show up without needing recognition. In the way they keep going even when no one is watching. And maybe that's the quiet truth about them. They were never trying to stand out. They were just trying to stand steady. But here's something worth thinking about. What if their way wasn't missing something? What if it was protecting something? A sense of self that doesn't depend on constant approval. A strength that doesn't need to be announced. A resilience that was built, not taught. Because in a world that often confuses noise for depth, Gen X reminds us of something simple. You don't have to say everything to feel everything, and you don't have to be seen all the time to matter. Sometimes the most powerful lives are the ones lived quietly, not invisible, just deeply real.